Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. So my guest today is Tim Clement-Jones, a Liberal Democrat peer, formerly a lawyer, and been at the heart of the Lib Dems and indeed the Liberal Party since the 80s at least, when indeed you were chair of the Liberal Party in 1986 to 1988. You became a peer in 98, but I want to take you back to the beginning. You went to Haileybury School, if I'm not wrong.
I did, and my elder brother went to rugby because my father went to rugby. But I was one of 5 children, so the who paid the bills was rather important. And so my grandfather, who went to Haileybury, insisted that he wasn't going to pay the fees unless I went to Haileybury. So I and my younger brother were both packed off to Haileybury. And actually, of course, it's a very good school, but nevertheless, we always felt that we would have been closer to my older brother.
Where were you brought up?
We were brought up everywhere. I was born in South Wales. We then moved to Sheffield. We then moved to Birmingham.
Why did you move around so much?
Well, my father was in business. I mean, he was a personnel manager and then personnel director, as they were called then. They weren't using the fancy title of human resources. And that was his métier. And so he moved around the country. And my elder sister and elder brother were both born in different places. So
actually, Haileybury was a sort of 5-year consistent dwelling in a sense.
Well, absolutely. And, we used the through train back to Birmingham for most of that time. But then we moved to Sussex. So it was quite a change. I mean, you can imagine having lived in Sheffield, Birmingham and South Wales, and then for most of my teenage life in Sussex, that was quite unusual.
I had a similar upbringing. My father was in business and moved around a lot. Where did you actually, in the end, plant your roots then? Or are you sort of permanently on the move still?
No, I'm an absolute Londoner. I'm not very good with welly boots and mud. I did have a cottage in the country for about 30 years, but finally gave up the weekend treks. And now I don't think you could uproot me from London.
So from Haileybury, of course, being a very brilliant man, you went to Imperial and then on to Trinity. And then where next?
Well, after Trinity, I got an articled clerkship, as they were called, interestingly in those days, very quill pen sounding, at Clifford Chance. They were called Coward Chance in those days. So you had to do a 2-year training period after going to the College of Law. And then I left them immediately after I'd done my training. And went on to another law firm, as they were called Johnson Hicks, and now they've been merged. Law firms are almost indistinguishable from what they were 40 years ago. So I moved on from there, and then I went in-house to a very interesting little multinational company in some ways called Letraset. And they did what was essentially the precursor to what you could do now, quite simply on an Apple Mac. They will rub down lettering, but they were covered by patents, copyright, trademarks, and so on. And that's where my love of intellectual property came from.
Yeah, and then eventually must have been artificial intelligence you picked up at an early age. But I want to come back to those later because they've been great passions of yours. Ultimately, you ended up back in the profession, didn't you? Because you were a London managing partner of DLA Piper from 2010s.
Yes, I love that job because although I'm not a great corporate lawyer, I do think I'm a reasonable leader and manager. And what we were trying to do, really, in a sense, was put DLA more on the map in the city because, we're a bit of an interloper. We were a bit of an interloper.
You became almost the biggest law firm in Britain, didn't you?
And the world, absolutely. I mean,
the world.
We're now kind of up there, 1, 2, 3, 4. They move around a bit depending on how well they do year to year. But DLA Piper is definitely now one of the top 5. Putting them on the map in the city was part of the agenda. So it was very exciting.
And how much of that? So you were there for 10 years, roughly?
I was there actually for 20 years.
20 years. So you saw this huge growth of the firm.
Huge growth. And of course, at that time, we had the inspirational Sir Nigel Knowles as our CEO. I mean, he grew them from a relatively small regional business to a major global law firm. And that is an extraordinary achievement.
Yeah. And you were global government relations partner as well. I mean, how does that align with being in the Lords, for example?
Well,
you've got to be quite careful, I guess.
I had to be very careful. It was all about strategy. It wasn't about anything to do with lobbying. And of course, people forget that quite a lot of government relations is how do you position yourself? Who do you talk to? You don't actually do the advocacy yourself. You basically may wind people up and point them into battle. But a lot of it I was chairing. I wasn't actually the sort of partner in charge, so to speak. I chaired a practice, so it was actually relatively okay.
And of course, one of the things about speaking in the Lords is that you have to declare your interest if it's on a subject which you have an involvement, which presumably you did on frequent occasions.
Yeah, you never. But of course, in that position, you make sure you never have what are called personal clients. That basically all you're doing basically is helping your colleagues perform their roles and get their strategies right. So, and of course, the rules have tightened up as the years have gone on.
How did you get involved in the Liberal Party as it was then?
Well, interestingly, I was a Tory at Cambridge. I was very much what was called
I'm glad to hear that.
a Quaker man. And of course, I was a member along with all the people who subsequently joined Tory cabinets like Richard Ryder and David Mellor and so on, of the Conservative Association. But after Cambridge, I was actually, I was very disillusioned by Ted Heath. I thought that he came in on a great sort of wave of enthusiasm. And I was very enthusiastic about the European project and all that kind of thing. And then suddenly we get a price and wage control economy, which he'd never really indicated that that's what we wanted. So I thought, well, if that is the solution, maybe he should have seen it was going to be the solution, and maybe he should have put a better strategy for it into place. And at the time, strangely enough, Jeremy Thorpe was actually a very inspirational leader of the Liberal Party. And they'd always advocated this kind of wage and price control, but in a much more coherent kind of a way. But the thing that I was mainly taken by, actually, was the fact that the Liberal Party were, and of course the Liberal Democrats still are, a very international party and very Europe-focused in that sense. And I think ultimately, that's what really attracted me. And so
And Thorpe was a very charismatic character. People forget that.
Completely. And he never forgot your name. You met him once as an ordinary member of the party. I met him in, 74, and he never, ever forgot your name. And he was like that with everybody. So he had enormous qualities. I mean, it's a tragedy in many ways. I remember him roaring around during the two 1974 elections, and sadly his hovercraft broke down one time, stuff like that. But nevertheless, it was a very energetic, attractive couple of elections. Sadly, I think the maximum we reached was 18% in the opinion polls. I think we were still sort of 11 or 12 MPs. So he never.
But he could have formed a coalition at one point, couldn't he?
Well, the numbers didn't quite add up. That is the kind of narrative that's still out there. But I don't think that actually he could have done it. It's rather like the narrative that was out there that said, "Oh, well, you shouldn't have done a deal with David Cameron because you could have done a deal with Gordon Brown." I don't think the numbers were actually there. It would have been a real problem for us.
And you seemingly got involved with the Liberal Party in the early 80s. Is that right?
through the lawyers first. Yeah. I help people.
And chairman of the Association of Liberal Lawyers.
Absolutely. I help people like Emlyn Hooson. He was our sort of legal spokesperson. And, you're in a sort of problem-solving mode in the Liberal Lawyers. I tried to turn them into a kind of really useful, solutions-oriented body, and I think that's the role we played for quite a long time. But of course, inevitably, doing that, you meet people, you get involved in the wider policy, and I took Clement Freud's place actually because he wasn't really very interested in running the party on our executive committee. So I was kind of his delegate onto the executive committee, and that's really how I got involved in helping run the party.
And you became chairman.
And I became chairman in 1986.
At quite a young age, to be honest.
Quite a young age, but it didn't feel, I was encouraged
86,
by Paul
you were
Tyler.
about 37, something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. But again...
Don't look a day older, of course.
Look, how much... I probably have less self-confidence now than I did then. You don't know what you don't know at that age,
But in 86, you took over... You knew at that point there was an election in 87,
yes.
Probably? So 87 was not a great result for the Lib Dems. In fact, it was a dreadful year for you because I think you lost your wife at that time. It must have been a frightful time.
It was, and it was a very...
some people say a shit time. But
because you're trying to help run the general election campaign and, Vicky was really, coming to the end of her life in July 1987. Yes, it was very tough and you're very conflicted in those circumstances, but we were incredibly lucky. We had fantastic family support and friends support. That's what happens. You have to step up to the plate, basically.
And in 88, of course, became the merger with the Social Democrat Party.
Absolutely.
Which, again, you've mentioned David Owen was not keen on. Talk us through the negotiations, because you must have been absolutely in the thick of it.
Well, I was. And we had an interesting situation, because ostensibly David Steele was the person who was running the negotiations. Actually, all the internal party convening was done by me. And so I had to kind of keep the thing together. We had ultras who really didn't want anything to do with the SDP. And then we had others who were absolutely dead enthusiastic about adopting the constitution of the SDP and, all the policies of the SDP. So we had quite a spectrum of opinion.
And didn't it manifest itself in the two conferences where you both had to vote on it?
Yeah,
and were you chairing that conference?
Well, we do. We have a rather arcane structure. So we have a conference committee where it's chaired. The sessions are chaired by different people. What I had to do was introduce one set of motions, and the president of the party, Adrian Slade, had to introduce another set of motions proposing the actual merger. So. The party officers did have to do the business. But, of course, what we were presenting was pretty much a take-it-or-leave-it package.
Absolutely fascinating time in British politics. Looking back, you confident the merger was the right thing?
Oh, absolutely. The most depressing thing was seeing... I love... Steve Norris is a very good friend of mine.
He was the Conservative mayoral candidate.
Yes, but he was also the candidate and the winner of the Epping Forest by-election. And it was a walkover for Steve because we were split. And the Richmond by-election, which William Hague won, was a walkover for William.
You mentioned one of the things you liked about the Liberal Party was the international side of things. You clearly like a bit of controversy because the two areas where you're very keen on business is Saudi Arabia and China, where you've been a strong advocate of continuing support, which are not uncontroversial countries at the moment.
I think I'm disappointed. Having to find oneself having espoused trade with, two major blocks, and you could include within, you could talk about the Arabian Peninsula, actually, because, I used to be very a frequent traveler to the UAE, having been part of the Saudi Britain Business Council, and of course, the China, very strong China connection because my late wife was Hong Kong Chinese, but things have changed enormously. And I do worry very much about the relationship with China and the fact that, Hong Kong is a very different place now than it used to be in terms of human rights and even the ability to do business and so on. But, I'm also a practical business person. I'm a realist, and I'm not too. I'm not going to, cut off our nose to spite our face in business and trade terms. But I just think that we have to be quite careful about who we deal with, how enthusiastic we are, and how much risk we take in terms of our future relationships.
Yeah, one of the issues here is the rule of law in dealing with both those countries. And obviously, when I was doing the trade agenda, heavily involved in both countries, and that must be a sort of something you wrestle with too.
Absolutely, and but at the same time, I think you have to make a distinction between the government for the moment, the regime for the moment, and the people. Some of the friendships I've got amongst Chinese people, both in China and here in the UK, and similarly in the Middle East and here. With people of Middle East background and so on, is one of life's great things. So I think you have to try and make that distinction, and you have to try and sort of see beyond the short term in that sense. But nevertheless, I still think that you have to be very realistic and sometimes quite tough about what you expect from a foreign government, basically.
Mm. Looking back at your career, there are several things which define it, in a sense, from the campaigning point of view, if we call it that, for want of a better word. I want to start with the Sunday trading laws in 94, which you were heavily involved in. That actually, for a lot of people who've whole generations have been brought up by fact that you can go shopping on Sunday. But of course, when you and I were young, Sunday was a dead day. Haileybury must have been very dull on a Sunday.
The pubs were open.
The pubs were open, yeah. You weren't allowed out to the shops there. Talk us through the Sunday trading. You were at Kingfisher at the time.
Absolutely.
Which was, of course, a big wholesale business.
Well, a great friend of mine, who is effectively my boss, Nigel Whittaker, was the director of corporate affairs. And, he very early on spotted the potential, basically, for liberalizing sundry trading laws. And, basically he and I spent, nearly 10 years. Yeah. Lobbying from Kingfisher during the 80s and early 90s, getting the laws changed. Now, there were several attempts, but we finally got it through in 92, I think.
And the anti, for want of a better word, was the church? The government? Who was your?
It was the ultras in the church, and also I think Usdaw, who eventually did a deal.
Usdaw?
They were the shop workers union, who were pretty strong across the retail sector, particularly in the supermarkets. They, for obvious reasons, they wanted to have a premium paid to be paid working on Sunday because this wasn't something traditional, and the agreement to do that by Tesco, as it turned out, who were quite heavily unionized, actually was the key that unlocked the whole thing at the end of the day.
But Tesco's at that point were the biggest retailer, or?
Yeah, they were. I think, I can't remember whether it was Lord Maclaurin, actually, who eventually was the guy who unlocked the whole thing, because he did a deal with Usdaw. And so we had quite a lot of MPs on side, but we didn't have that many Labour MPs. So that was actually...
Why was Labour against it?
Well, I think it's a matter of worker protection, and I can very much see the point of from their point of view, basically. Mm-hmm. So what it demonstrated to me, because Nigel always kept in touch with what was then called the Jubilee Centre, who were the ultra evangelists who were anti anything happening on a Sunday, basically. He was brilliant at staying in touch with the opposition, and it's a political lesson I've never forgotten. You've got to understand what your political opponent is trying to do. That's why I read the Mail on Sunday, for heaven's sake. Goodness me.
Great paper.
It's one of those lessons in life that Nigel taught me, and I'm eternally grateful.
And then, of course, you are able to have a platform when you join the House in 98 to campaign on other things, one of which, of course, was tobacco advertising. You were very heavily involved in the tobacco advertising bill.
Yes, I was.
And what was the background to that?
Well, the background was that, strangely enough, the Labour government had promised to ban tobacco advertising. And if you remember, there was all the Bernie Ecclestone thing. Blair had accepted, I think, £1 million from Tony, from Bernie Ecclestone. And I think subsequently they agreed to repay it, actually, if memory serves me right. But then by some extraordinary
then he offered our
thing,
Green Party some money as well, which we declined, and I was treasurer.
But then after whatever it was, the 83 election, suddenly nothing appeared, and despite manifesto commitments. So as a wheeze, actually, this is the interesting thing, and a lovely person who is now a peer, Celia Thomas, Baroness Thomas, suggested that I actually table the exact...
And she's Labour peer.
She's a Lib Dem peer.
Lib Dem peer.
She used to run our office in the Whips, and then she became a peer. And she suggested, well, why don't you just table the exact same bill, and we'll embarrass the government into giving you time for a private member's bill and get it through, because, what's not to like? And so actually, I took up hours and hours of private members' time in committee, because the Tobacco and Pipe Smokers Association or whatever spent hours and hours briefing against the bill, but we got it through. And then the government, I think it was Dawn Primarello at the time, actually, who, when she was a health minister, made sure that they got the sufficient majority once the bill came to the Commons.
And this is not a rare thing. Often happens, but this is a bill that was started in the Lords and then went to the Commons.
Absolutely, and very, very few private members' bill coming out of the Lords ever see the light of day after they go to the Commons. So you've got to get government backing, and of course, how could they not back the bill? It was word for word. I made sure that there wasn't a single amendment that got through. It was exactly in the form in which the government had put it forward before the 1983 general election.
Another of the great things that you've been a champion of is intellectual property, as you mentioned earlier, particularly in the photography industry. You and I clashed swords a bit when I was taking that bill through the Lords. This is obviously through your exposure as a lawyer to it, and absolutely right to champion the requirement for it. But what's the sort of drive and what's kept giving you the sort of endless passion for it?
Well, it's interesting because I've always been involved in businesses that have had strong intellectual property or strong branding, if you like. It all starts with brands. It was Letraset, then it was London Weekend Television, then it was Grand Metropolitan, now Diageo. We had all those brands, retail brands, admittedly not necessarily consumer product brands, and then Kingfisher, which was Woolworths and B&Q and Comet and Superdrug and so on. So the power of the brand and the importance of protecting intellectual property around brands is something that I've always been extremely conscious of. And then, of course, I moved into speaking on the creative industries in the early 2000s. And again,
you were spokesman on DCMS stuff.
I was DCMS spokesperson, which absolutely was a great role to have, and because you could see the digitization of the creative industries, but again, intellectual property and the digital economy, they're absolutely married together. Really important, trademarks, patents, and so on and so forth. So I've always felt that rewarding creation and creativity is really, really important. But it's nice to say that, but without something tangible that you can enforce, it's very difficult.
I think by and large we're very strong on intellectual property in this country. I think the regulation is good, and then of course the really current thing that you're involved in, and you started in 2017, I think, as chair of the Lord Select Committee on AI, artificial intelligence, which is now the current buzz thing. And you're a member of the all-party group still, but it is now something that really is occupying a lot of your speaking and thinking time.
Yeah, you're quite right, Jonathan. It's all-consuming. I started the all-party group actually in 2016 with Stephen Metcalfe, who was then chair of the Science and Technology Committee, and we get on enormously well. But we both sat down at a breakfast with the Industry and Parliament Trust back in 2016 and said, we've got to do something here. The parliamentarians don't understand anything about, the risks and opportunities of AI coming down the track. So
we have to remember this was 7 years ago where AI was not the big topic of conversation.
I think we had a better inkling than some about it. And so as a result of setting up the all-party group, I then became chair of the select committee, as you say. And, that was, again, an eye-opener, because the wonderful thing about select committees is that they're resourced.
And this is the Lord's Select Committee.
Lord's Select Committee. They're resourced to be able to really inquire in some depth. So we spent a year looking at the risks and opportunities and, what did we need to have a set of ethics? Did we need to regulate? And so on and so forth. And funnily enough, we did 2 reports. We did AI in the UK, ready, willing, and able, ? And then we did AI in the UK, no room for complacency, as a kind of follow-up report in 2020 to say, well, is the government doing what it said it was going to do? So again, we were very lucky in being able to do 2 reports and really stay on the case. And of course, now the government's published its white paper in the face, actually, of really quite a lot of public concern about the impact of generative AI, ChatGPT, GPT-4, and so on and so forth. So you're right. There's a heck of a lot happening out there at the moment. And then, the narrative on AI has always been rather lurid. You've got people talking about extinction and existential threats. And you've got some people like Elon Musk saying it's more dangerous than nuclear weapons and so on. So actually staying calm and saying, yes, we can regulate this appropriately without destroying innovation, if you like, is perfectly feasible. So
where do you think this is all going to end?
I'm an optimist. I do believe that at the end of the day, we're going to get much greater convergence over the way we see regulation over AI. It may not be that we all have the same regulation in terms of, you shall do this, you shall do that. But when it comes to requirements, say, for instance, to have ethical standards for testing, or ethical standards for using data, or ethical standards for explaining what an AI is doing, then I think at the moment, the way that we're converging is quite
But
good.
Are we not in danger of being at different speeds with other countries? I mean, we will obviously regulate because we like regulating. America will almost certainly regulate, but China may well not.
They may
join
well
coming
not.
back to the full circle of your relationships with China.
Well, full circle. But of course, China has a rather different philosophy. China doesn't like its government having to do anything particularly compulsory. But private sector in China, I mean, they've adopted the Beijing principles. They've started adopting regulation over generative AI by the private sector, developed by the private sector. So actually, China is not an outlier in this respect. And if they do become an outlier, then of course you've got the question, when you procure an AI system, you have to ask, well, okay, so what standards does it conform to? And inevitably, if the National Institute for Science and Technology in the States, which is the really dominant player out there in standard setting, says this doesn't conform to our standards, then that's pretty heavy stuff for any AI developer who wants to exploit their product commercially.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. Going back to the Lords, obviously the Lib Dem party are far bigger in terms of size than the elected party, which almost makes you hold the balance of power in the Lords at the moment, which must be fascinating for your merry band.
Yes. Well, of course, what is wonderful is that we've got such a fresh, lively bunch of young MPs.
This is not a promotional video for the Lib Dems, by the way.
But no, we're more than gender balanced in the Commons. But you're right. I mean, obviously, we have greater numbers. We're able to look at things in much greater depth. And so I have an extremely good relationship with my colleagues. But at the end of the day, even though we've got, 60 or so peers, we defer to our elected colleagues. They're the ones who have to do the hard yards. They're the ones who have to get re-elected at general elections. And, and we have a culture of peers going down to help at by-elections, however ancient they may be. And I'm on my way to one in the near future.
I won't ask you which one, but very best of luck. Tim, it's been fantastic that you spared the time and giving us so much really interesting life you've had, and you continue to make this huge contribution in our place. Thank you so much for sparing the time.
Oh, great, Jonathan. Thanks. It's been a huge pleasure.